Would you believe if I told you that a tiny pinch of nutmeg was once worth as much as gold? That ordinary spices in your kitchen today once sparked wars, financed empires, transformed global banking, and led to one of history's least known genocides. This is the extraordinary story of how spices changed the world and how Indonesia turned a painful colonial past into a powerful post colonial identity. For Europeans in the 17th century, spices weren't simply ingredients, they were luxury goods, they were medicine, they were status symbols. Cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, ginger, and pepper were so valuable that they rivaled gold in price. Nutmeg was believed to cure everything from a plague to coughs. As these spices traveled from Southeast Asia to Europe, changing hands repeatedly along long routes, their prices could rise by more than 100%. The enormous profits reshaped European commerce. The spice trade fueled revolutionary credit-based finance, strengthened banking systems, and laid foundations for modern free enterprise. But behind this prosperity lay extraordinary violence. If spices made Europe rich, who paid the price? The answer lies in a small Indonesian island chain called Banda. The Banda archipelago possessed something almost no other place on earth had. It was the world's main source of nutmeg and mace. For European trading companies, controlling Banda meant controlling immense wealth. In 1621, the Dutch East India Company invaded the islands. Its objective was simple: create a monopoly. The result was catastrophic. Thousands of native Bandanese were killed or enslaved. Many survivors fled into forests, hills, and the sea, where countless others perished. The Banda Massacre became one of the earliest examples of corporate violence carried out in the pursuit of commercial profit. And the struggle over one tiny island would even redraw the global map. Britain and the Netherlands fought for years over another small chain of islands famous for nutmeg. The rivalry ended with the peace treaty of Breda in 1667. Britain abandoned its claims to run, the Dutch secured dominance over the Spice Islands and strengthened their influence across the region. The battle for spices had become a battle for empire. Dutch expansion did not stop with Banda. During the 18th century, Dutch control spread across Java. In the 19th century, it expanded into Sumatra. By the 20th century, nearly the entire Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, had fallen under colonial rule. The economy evolved from spices into plantation agriculture. Sugar, coffee, tea, rubber, tobacco. Together, these colonial industries generated around 1/3 of Dutch government revenues. But colonial rule wasn't maintained through trade alone. It relied on overwhelming military force. When Balinese kingdoms resisted Dutch conquest in 1906 and 1908, colonial troops deployed machine guns and artillery against warriors armed largely with traditional daggers. Violence continued even after the Second World War. As Indonesia demanded independence, Dutch forces carried out widespread military operations. Between 1945 and 1949, Dutch special forces summarily executed thousands. One of the worst atrocities occurred in South Sulawesi on January 28, 1947. Acting under Captain Raymond Westerling's orders, Dutch troops executed 208 men in a single massacre intended to crush resistance. The violence that began with the spice trade had evolved into centuries of colonial domination. Dutch officials believed their empire would last forever. In 1936, Governor General Bonifacius Cornelis de Jong declared that the Dutch had ruled Indonesia for 300 years and expected to remain there for another 300 years. Only after that, he suggested, could independence even be discussed. History would prove him wrong. One man would transform Indonesia from a colony into a symbol of global decolonization. His name was Sukarno. In the early 20th century, suspected driver, he began his activities against the backdrop of immense violence when suspected revolutionaries were imprisoned or exiled. Yet Dutch repression only strengthened Indonesian nationalism. Sukarno emerged as its most powerful voice. Japan's victory over Dutch colonial forces during the Second World War created an opening. Sukarno declared independence, but for him, independence meant far more than replacing one flag with another. Political sovereignty, economic self-reliance, and cultural confidence. He argued that colonialism could continue even after formal independence through new forms of Western dominance. Sukarno's next move would change world politics. In 1955, Indonesia hosted the Bandung Conference. For the first time, leaders from Asia and Africa gathered without Western powers dominating the agenda. Representing more than half of the world's population, they promoted economic cooperation and opposed colonialism and neo-colonialism. The conference became a milestone for newly independent nations. Its influence extended beyond Indonesia. It preceded Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal and inspired decolonization movements across Asia and Africa. India played a central role. Jawaharlal Nehru worked closely with Sukarno to build this vision of Asian-African solidarity. Their partnership reflected civilizational connection stretching back centuries. Sukarno had been India's chief guest at the country's first Republic Day celebrations in 1950. Even earlier, Nehru had brought anti-colonial leaders together at the Asian Relations Conference in New Delhi in 1947. For both leaders, Sukarno and Nehru, political independence required international cooperation among formerly colonized nations. But Indonesia's response to colonialism wasn't only political, it was cultural, and surprisingly, it also involved comic books. During Dutch rule, Western comics had entered Indonesia. Many viewed them as vehicles for Western popular culture. Sukarno believed they threatened local cultural values. Instead of rejecting comics altogether, Indonesians reinvented them. Indonesian artists began creating Wayang comics based on Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Hindu-Indian epics. These ancient Indian epics had been part of Indonesian culture for centuries through Wayang, the country's celebrated shadow puppet tradition. Wayang itself is a remarkable example of cultural exchange. Some performances use flat leather puppets called Wayang kulit projected onto illuminated screens. Others feature three-dimensional wooden figures known as Wayang klitik. These performances combine Indian epics with Indonesian folklore, philosophy, and local traditions. The stories became uniquely Indonesian. Wayang comics offered something new. Traditional puppet performances often lasted through the night. Comic books made these stories accessible to modern audiences while preserving moral teachings. They also provided an alternative to imported Western comics featuring Andersen's fairy tales, Alexander the Great, and Marco Polo. The Ramayana and Mahabharata became cultural tools for preserving cultural identity in a modern medium. They weren't simply comics, they became instruments of nation building. Indonesian artists transformed the Mahabharata into works that reached readers across Indonesia. Wayang comics expressed an Indonesian cultural identity distinct from the Western one. Using the Indonesian language, artists brought the Mahabharata to audiences regardless of their social background, making them guardians of cultural values whose work revitalized Indonesian comics while preserving ethical teachings. The adaptation of the Ramayana and Mahabharata became much more than cultural preservation. It became part of post-colonial nation building. In Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim majority country and third largest democracy, these stories supported an inclusive nation or national identity rooted in Pancasila, or the philosophy emphasizing humanitarianism, democracy, and social justice. Indonesia demonstrated that civilizations can interact without erasing one another. This story of Indonesia begins with spices that transformed the global economy. It passes through conquest, monopoly, colonial violence, and independence. And it ends with a nation that answered colonialism not only through political freedom, but also through cultural confidence. The same islands that once supplied Europe with nutmeg eventually gave the world another lesson. That the most enduring power isn't found in monopolizing or empires, it's found in a civilization's ability to preserve its identity while embracing influences from across the world. And that perhaps is the most valuable export Indonesia has ever offered to humanity. If you like this video, do let me know in the comments. Thank you.